What do some people do when they know they are guilty? Not when they have been accused unfairly, not when there is genuine confusion, not when there is a misunderstanding, but when they know exactly what they did. They know the evidence exists. They know the facts are there. And they know they have been confronted with the truth. The answer often surprises people because most of us assume that guilt naturally leads to accountability. We expect someone who knows they are wrong to admit it, apologize, and take responsibility for their actions. But for some people, guilt does not lead to accountability. It leads to strategy. When someone knows they are guilty, one of the first reactions you may see is denial. This is different from a person who is simply embarrassed, afraid, or struggling to face a mistake. In some cases, denial becomes a way to protect their image and avoid uncomfortable consequences. Admitting wrongdoing can threaten the way they want others to see them. They may view themselves as honest, responsible, intelligent, successful, or morally superior. When evidence challenges that image, accepting responsibility can feel extremely uncomfortable. As a result, they may reject facts that appear obvious to everyone else. Even when confronted with messages, screenshots, emails, recordings, or witness accounts, they may continue insisting that nothing happened. They may claim the evidence is inaccurate. They may argue that people misunderstood what they saw. They may insist that everyone else is mistaken. What makes this especially confusing is the confidence with which these statements are delivered. Most people believe that undeniable proof will eventually lead someone to acknowledge reality. Instead, the person may become even more certain. They may repeat the same denial over and over again. They may speak with complete confidence despite evidence that clearly contradicts what they are saying. At that point, the goal is often no longer finding the truth. The goal becomes protecting themselves from shame, criticism, consequences, or responsibility. If admitting guilt feels threatening, denial becomes a shield. Over time, this can leave other people feeling frustrated, confused, and emotionally drained. They may wonder if they explained things poorly. They may believe they need better evidence. They may spend hours trying to prove something that already seems obvious. But the problem is often not a lack of evidence. The problem is that the other person does not want to accept what the evidence reveals. And as long as avoiding responsibility feels more important than facing reality, the denial may continue. When denial is no longer enough, another common response can appear. The person begins rewriting history. This can be one of the most confusing experiences for anyone involved because it can make clear events suddenly feel uncertain. Instead of admitting what happened, the story begins to change. Conversations are remembered differently. Agreements are described differently. Promises that once seemed clear suddenly become vague. Important details disappear. New explanations appear. And facts that were never mentioned before suddenly become central to the story. The purpose is often not to create a perfect version of events. The purpose is to create enough confusion that accountability becomes harder to achieve. A simple situation can suddenly become complicated. If they lied, they may claim they were misunderstood. If they broke a commitment, they may insist no commitment ever existed. If they said something hurtful, they may argue that their words were taken out of context. Details that make them appear responsible become smaller. Details that make them appear innocent become larger. Gradually, the original issue gets buried under layer after layer of revision. What makes this so effective is that memory is naturally imperfect. Most people understand that different individuals can remember events differently. Because of this, they often give others the benefit of the doubt. They revisit old conversations. They replay situations in their minds. They question their own recollection. They start wondering whether they misunderstood something important. Instead of discussing the behavior itself, the discussion turns into an argument about what really happened. The focus shifts away from accountability, and that shift often benefits the person trying to avoid responsibility. When someone knows they are guilty, another powerful tactic may appear. They begin shifting blame. Instead of addressing their own actions, they redirect attention towards someone else. Very often, that someone is the person confronting them. The moment accountability enters the conversation, the subject begins to change. What started as a discussion about their behavior suddenly becomes a discussion about yours. The transition can happen so quickly that many people do not even notice it. One moment you are talking about dishonesty. The next moment you are defending yourself against accusations. If you confront them about a lie, they may accuse you of being suspicious. If you bring up a broken promise, they may criticize the way you communicated. If you discuss disrespectful behavior, they may bring up a mistake you made months or years ago. The original issue begins to disappear. Instead of explaining their actions, they place you in a position where you feel obligated to explain yours. This can create significant emotional confusion. Most people enter difficult conversations expecting both sides to discuss the problem honestly. When blame suddenly gets redirected toward them, they naturally become defensive. They start explaining themselves. They begin justifying their reactions. They focus on proving they are not the problem. Meanwhile, attention moves away from the person who was originally being questioned. The conversation changes direction completely. Over time, repeated blame shifting can have a powerful effect. A person may begin feeling responsible for problems they did not create. They may start believing that if they had behaved differently, the other person's actions would never have happened. They may carry guilt that does not belong to them. In many cases, blame shifting is not about discovering the truth. It is about escaping responsibility by placing the burden somewhere else. When someone knows they are guilty, they may also attempt to make others question their perception of reality. This can happen through repeated contradiction, dismissal, and distortion of events. Rather than addressing the issue directly, They challenge your understanding of what happened. You may clearly remember a conversation. You may remember a promise. You may remember specific words, actions, or events. Yet the other person insists that none of it happened the way you remember. They may tell you that you misunderstood. They may say you are exaggerating. They may insist that you are overreacting. They may argue that your interpretation is completely wrong. If you provide evidence, they may focus on attacking your conclusions instead of discussing the evidence itself. Gradually, the conversation stops being about their behavior. Instead, it becomes about whether your memory, judgment, and perception can be trusted. This process can be deeply confusing. A single disagreement may not have much impact, but repeated exposure can slowly create self-doubt. You may replay conversations repeatedly. You may question your own memory. You may seek reassurance from other people. You may start doubting things you once felt completely certain about. The more uncertainty develops, the easier it becomes for someone else to control the narrative. And when that happens, accountability becomes much harder to achieve. Another surprising reaction occurs when the person who caused the harm begins presenting themselves as the victim. This can be extremely confusing. The focus suddenly shifts away from the people affected by their behavior. Instead, attention moves toward their emotional experience. Rather than discussing the pain they caused, they begin discussing the pain they are feeling. Rather than addressing the consequences of their actions, they focus on the consequences of being confronted. The conversation changes direction. Accountability begins to fade into the background. Sympathy becomes the new focus. This victim position can appear in many different forms. They may talk about how stressed they are. They may describe how overwhelmed they feel. They may emphasize how difficult their life has been. They may explain how unfairly they believe they are being treated. Sometimes they focus on their intentions instead of their actions. They may argue that they never meant to hurt anyone. They may insist that their good intentions should matter more than the actual outcome. At other times, they may describe themselves as the real target of the situation. They may claim they are being attacked. They may portray themselves as misunderstood. They may suggest that everyone is being unfair to them. The result is often the same. The original issue receives less attention. The harm experienced by others becomes secondary, and the discussion begins revolving around the emotions of the person being confronted. For many people, this creates a strong sense of guilt. They start feeling sorry for the person who caused the problem. They begin questioning whether they were too harsh. They wonder whether confronting the issue was the right thing to do. As sympathy increases, accountability often decreases. That is why these situations can feel so confusing. The facts may seem clear, the evidence may seem obvious, yet the conversation somehow moves further and further away from the original problem. Instead of responsibility, there is denial. Instead of honesty, there is revision. Instead of accountability, there is blame shifting. Instead of clarity, there is confusion. And instead of focusing on the harm that was done, the attention often turns toward protecting an image, avoiding consequences, and escaping responsibility. Understanding these patterns does not mean assuming the worst about people. It does not mean labeling everyone who disagrees with you. It simply means recognizing behaviors that can appear when someone is unwilling to face the truth about their actions. The more clearly you recognize these patterns, the easier it becomes to stay grounded in facts, trust your observations, and avoid being pulled into cycles of confusion that prevent real accountability and honest resolution. They may describe themselves as misunderstood, attacked, unfairly judged, or treated badly. In some situations, they may even suggest that being confronted about their behavior is more painful than the behavior itself. As this happens, the original issue begins to fade into the background. The focus slowly shifts away from what happened and toward how they feel about being questioned. What makes this approach so effective is that most people are naturally compassionate. When someone appears upset, hurt, or distressed, people often want to help. They want to understand what the person is going through. They want to reduce conflict and ease emotional pain. Someone who wants to avoid responsibility may take advantage of this natural kindness. Instead of discussing the damage that was caused, the conversation turns into a discussion about their feelings. Instead of examining the behavior, everyone begins examining their emotional reaction to being confronted. Over time, this pattern can create a cycle where accountability becomes increasingly difficult. Every attempt to address a problem is met with stories about their struggles. Every concern is met with explanations about their hardships. Every discussion about responsibility becomes a discussion about their suffering. The person who was hurt may eventually start feeling guilty for bringing up valid concerns. They may begin apologizing for speaking up. They may back away from important conversations. They may minimize their own experiences just to restore peace and avoid conflict. As a result, the person who caused the problem avoids the uncomfortable process of examining their own actions. Attention, sympathy, and emotional energy become focused on them. Responsibility slowly disappears from the conversation. Validation and protection become the center of attention. When someone knows they are guilty, protecting their public image can become more important than addressing the harm they caused. This often leads to what could be described as image management. Rather than focusing on repairing relationships or correcting mistakes, they focus on controlling how others see the situation. For people who place great importance on reputation, approval, admiration, or social status, exposure can feel threatening. If their behavior becomes known, the image they have carefully created may begin to crack. Because of this, they may work hard to shape how others understand the situation. This process often happens quietly. Friends may hear a story before you know it has been told. Family members may receive information that you never knew was being shared. Co-workers or mutual acquaintances may hear a version of events that is carefully designed to create a specific impression. Important details may be left out. Context may disappear. Your reactions may be highlighted, while their actions receive very little attention. Facts that make them appear responsible may be minimized or ignored completely. In many cases, they do not need to tell obvious lies. They simply tell a selective version of the story. The information they choose to share creates a picture that works in their favor. One common feature of image management is something that happens before any public confrontation occurs. If they believe questions are coming, they may quietly establish themselves as the reasonable person in the situation. They may present themselves as misunderstood. They may describe themselves as someone who has been treated unfairly. They may position themselves as the person who has been hurt. As a result, other people form opinions before hearing all the facts. This can make it much harder for the person who was harmed to be believed later. When people already have a story in their minds, they often interpret new information through that story. The emotional impact of this can be significant. You may discover that others seem to know a completely different version of events. You may feel confused by how differently people see the situation. Relationships may become strained. Trust may be damaged. You may even feel isolated and misunderstood. Meanwhile, the person protecting their image benefits from the confusion. External validation helps protect their reputation. It also reduces the social consequences they might otherwise face. When someone knows they are guilty, another common strategy is deflection. Unlike blame shifting, which places responsibility on someone else, deflection works by moving attention away from the issue altogether. The goal is not necessarily to prove innocence. The goal is to make sure the conversation never stays focused on the original problem long enough to reach a meaningful conclusion. If attention keeps moving, accountability becomes much harder to achieve. Deflection can take many forms. A person may suddenly change the subject when uncomfortable facts are raised. They may introduce a completely different problem. They may bring up a disagreement from the past. They may focus on an unrelated issue that has little connection to the current discussion. If asked a direct question, they may provide an answer that sounds relevant, but never actually addresses the question itself. The conversation begins moving in multiple directions at once. Side topics appear. New conflicts emerge. Additional concerns suddenly become urgent. Before long, the original issue becomes buried under distractions. What makes this tactic particularly frustrating is that the new topics may seem important. Some of the concerns they raise may even be legitimate. There may be real issues worth discussing. The problem is not always the topic itself. The problem is the timing. These new subjects often appear at the exact moment attention is focused on behavior that needs to be addressed. As a result, the conversation becomes scattered. Progress slows down. Nothing gets resolved. Many people do not recognize deflection immediately because they enter discussions expecting cooperation and problem solving. They naturally follow each new topic in an attempt to resolve every concern. Hours later, they realize the original issue was never discussed properly. The conversation feels exhausting. A great deal of energy has been spent, yet very little has actually been accomplished. For someone trying to avoid responsibility, deflection can serve as a protective shield. By constantly redirecting attention, they prevent a sustained examination of their actions. The discussion becomes confusing enough that consequences may never fully arrive. One of the most confusing reactions can happen when someone suddenly becomes charming, affectionate, kind, or seemingly remorseful after being confronted. After denying responsibility, changing the story, shifting blame, or avoiding difficult conversations, they may unexpectedly become warm and attentive. For the person who has been hurt, this shift can feel like a breakthrough. It may appear that real understanding has finally arrived. It may seem that genuine change is about to happen. This emotional shift can be powerful. After a long period of conflict, confusion, or disappointment, kindness can feel like relief. Hope begins to return. The future starts to look different. However, it is important to pay attention not only to the apology itself, but also to what follows. In healthy relationships, apologies are usually connected to self-reflection. The person acknowledges what happened. They accept responsibility. They show empathy for the impact of their actions.